As of the scripting of this video, NewFrame Plus recently made a video about the over-animation of Zenless Zone Zero. For the record, I haven't played the game myself, but I like critique, especially ones that go into the details of animation. Unfortunately, NewFrame Plus doesn't go as in-depth as it thinks it does. To avoid any confusion, my claim is not that Zenless doesn't have over-animation. That's not the point I'm making. What I am saying is that the video by NewFrame Plus does an incredibly poor job at making that critique. Their video only appeals to people who already agreed with the conclusion, or to people who couldn't keep track of what was actually being said. The way the video is structured, it first covers what over-animation is. It then goes into the critique, and then finishes with why we should care. To Daniel's credit, taking time to define terms is a good thing. If anything, the issue is he doesn't do it enough. Clear terms and clear language help to eliminate misinterpretation and any confusion in what's being said. It provides the foundation to build coherent arguments. This section, along with the intro, takes up the first 5 to 6 minutes of the video. Over-animation is defined as motion without purpose. The operative word here is what it means by purpose, but naturally that depends on the context of the animation that you're critiquing. He elaborates by describing the different forms it can take, but the fact of the matter is that it depends. How we differentiate between animation that is energetic and complex, that is appropriate versus inappropriate, has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. As he mentions in the video, over-animation can be hard to recognize without experience and a trained eye.
What over-animation looks like is going to vary from project to project, and animation which might look way too exaggerated in one context may feel just right in another. But it's also important to remember that it is very possible to execute on a chosen style poorly. And there are fundamentals of animation craft which continue to apply regardless of one style. Still, it can be pretty hard to recognize over-animation without experience and a trained eye. And even then, not all animators will agree.
So it's all the more reason why examples and getting into the details are necessary. The section about why we should care about over-animation happens at around the 13-minute mark and takes up the remainder of the video. So the actual critique section is not that long. Now that I've recapped the structure of the video, we can get into the actual critique section. The way that I'll be approaching this is by letting the video play out and interjecting when appropriate.
Just so everyone can get their bearings, let me give you a quick tour of Zenless Zone Zero's character animation contents. The majority of the game's animation exists across a few specific modes: combat, exploration, menus, conversation sequences, and cinematics. Now, I think that there are some minor examples of over-animation scattered across all of these modes. Like, this floaty, keep-alive motion they constantly put on these characters anytime they have to hold a pose is very swimmy. Now, I do get why it is here. A complete lack of motion would be worse. It would just make them feel dead.
That means it has a purpose.
And using lots of flapping motion on hair and clothes to keep otherwise static characters feeling alive is, like, that's anime aesthetic 101.
It's not that anime uses motion on static characters, but on poses that are static. Unless that's his way of throwing low-key shade, it's a sloppy use of language. Be precise with your words.
Even so, I don't love this execution.
Why did we change examples? We were just talking about these dialogue sequences. Why did it switch to this pose of her sitting? So add this to a list of don'ts when doing critique, and that's changing your example midway when making a point.
It's one thing having that floaty, drifting texture on loose extremities, but having it on the character's torso and center of gravity just makes them feel weightless.
Alright, so we're given something specific, something we can verify. The observation made about the torso and center of gravity being in motion is true, she's definitely moving. The conclusion, the underlying assumption that the torso and center of gravity moving makes it look weightless, is plainly incorrect, because we do exactly that all the time in real life. Anytime we move or shift our weight while sitting or standing, we're shifting our center of gravity. That doesn't somehow make us appear weightless. So that part of the critique is just taking a relatively simple observation and extending it far beyond what makes any sense to. Weightlessness in animation is its own can of worms. and it involves more than just simply pointing out that the center of gravity is moving.
It looks like every character is trying to hold a pose while submerged in a wave pool.
Okay, so now we go back to the original example of the dialogue sequences, but we're relying on hyperbole and overextending the critique from the prior example when we already established before that the flowing motion is part of the anime aesthetic. And that's it for this part. The video moves on to a different point from here. So what you have in this section is a critique that points out that there is emotion, that there is a purpose for it to be there, acknowledge that it's part of the aesthetic, and then miss the point anyways. Believe it or not, this is the best part of the critique, because it was at least somewhat narrowed in scope by talking about just the idle animation and pointing out something specific.
And I'd level some similar criticisms at the application of real-time physics on these characters across the entire game. Having some dynamic overlap and follow-through on your character's hair and jackets and jiggly bits is good, it helps them feel organic, but this is a lot. And I'm not even specifically talking about the fan service-y aspect either. Horniness aside, the large amount of overlap on every single clump of hair or loose bit of clothing on these characters layers a significant amount of white noise motion on top of everything these characters do, especially if they're moving a lot.
This section of the critique might seem appropriately scoped because it shows a lot of the character menu select animations. However, it's important to remember that he's addressing the use of real-time physics and overlap in every animation across the entire game, not just these menu ones. This is a very broad and general claim. When we discuss visual noise, we're fundamentally talking about clarity and readability. Overlap by its nature adds a layer of complexity to animation. It's in the word overlap, to share an area in common with, to layer on top of another, to cover over. So simply pointing out that overlap merely exists isn't enough to substantiate a claim of visual noise. To support such a statement, he needs to address how that overlap impacts the viewer's ability to read or follow the action on screen. Furthermore, the overlap produced by real-time physics isn't a uniform element. Different characters have different hairstyles at different lengths, different clothing of different lengths, and different accessories at different lengths. It varies depending on a range of factors, and even the motions themselves will produce different kinds of overlap. So the critique fails to account for this variability, and as a result, it overgeneralizes. Each character's animations are distinct, and different movements will naturally create different layers of overlap, making it difficult, if not outright unreasonable, to apply a sweeping critique of visual noise to all animations of an entire game, especially when it doesn't use specific examples to back it up. For the record, playing video in the background that may be tangentially related to what you're saying should not be mistaken for as going through examples. By the time he finishes making the claim about visual noise, about 10 different animations had played out in the background. No direct reference to them is made. They're not broken down or gone into with any detail. And what is critique? A detailed assessment.
This brings me to the game's cinematics, which contain, I think, the game's biggest animation problems. And as I say that, I imagine some of you probably think I am out of my mind. And I can understand that, because look at this. Are these shots not filled with the kind of stylized, exaggerated animation I am so often praising on this channel? Heck, a significant number of the tens of millions of people who have played Zenless Zone Zero probably downloaded the game in the first place because they saw how cool the animation in these cinematics looks. And I get it, because there is a lot of cool-looking animation here.
This part is weirdly defensive.
These action sequences are so fun to look at. Like, you could make a fair argument for this being empty eye candy, the animation equivalent of style over substance, but while I do fully agree that there is a very important difference between great character animation and animation which just looks eye-catching and cool, I also think that it's okay to just enjoy style for style's sake sometimes, especially when that style's being delivered at an exceptionally high level of skill. Anime action is fun spectacle.
As opposed to non-anime action not being fun spectacle?
And I legitimately think Zenless Zone Zero delivers on that brand of 3D anime spectacle better than most. For me, the issues start when that style over substance approach starts bleeding into characters' acting, because that is where over-animation has the potential to cause much more significant problems.
There is a misapplication of the phrase style over substance. Style over substance is often used in reference to storytelling and writing, but that's not what the subject of this video is. It's about animation. What is the style and what is the substance in the context of animation? The substance of good animation is good animation, so it doesn't matter if it's for the purpose of an action sequence or two characters talking to each other. A false dichotomy is being drawn. When people use aphorisms like style over substance in a context where it doesn't make sense, it shows that they're opting for familiar rhetoric that may appear to sound intelligent, but is ultimately superficial. He tries to make it appear balanced by offering praise, but it's very backhanded and disingenuous. If no meaningful critique is going to be made about the action sequences, then why is any of this being brought up? It's mainly to sneak in that idea of style over substance, where he makes a very rash assumption that the approach, not the details of the animation, but the approach is style over substance. Here we have a comment, a level of presumptuousness about the creator's intent and methodology that is unjustified. When making a critique about animation, it should focus on the details of the animation and its effectiveness.
So let's talk about problems. The character performances in these cinematics tend to be very animated, very exaggerated, and that's not inherently bad, at all. I really do want to stress I am a fan of what they are attempting to do here. In execution, though, a lot about this attempt is falling short. There are a lot of stock animation and acting cliches to be found in these performances. A lot of characters pantomiming emotions, rather than expressing them. Now, to be fair, anime is an art that thrives on tropes and archetypes, and that's fine. There is nothing inherently bad or flawed about using a trope. But when it comes to animated acting, leaning too hard into the performance cliches associated with those tropes can be a problem. And some of these shots are like watching an acting cliche speedrun. Like, how many moe poses can you squeeze into 5 seconds?
These statements are vague. Stock animation, acting cliché, and pantomiming emotions are not clearly defined nor elaborated on. What does stock animation mean in this context? What does acting cliché mean in this context? What does pantomiming mean in this context? We're talking about animation where characters can afford to act in exaggerated ways that would be less appropriate in live-action acting. Once again, broad generalizations are being made without using specific examples to elaborate on where the supposed stock animation or pantomiming emotions are detracting from the performance. Instead, random clips from various cinematics are played in the background, hoping that people mindlessly nod their head in agreement. Good critique relies on clear language, clear terms, and clear communication. I need to take this opportunity to explain why the term cliché should be avoided in any critique. If it isn't obvious, the problem with the term is that it's a superficial label. You can say it about anything. Not only is it highly subjective, but it's a cop-out from having to put in the work to a more thoughtful examination. It implies a lack of nuance or deeper understanding of the subject that you're critiquing. It's okay to use in casual conversation, but in a critique, at best it can be used as a starting point for a more detailed analysis, not as an outright dismissal. It effectively turns into, "It isn't good because I said so," which isn't very constructive.
These acting issues are further exacerbated by the overly enthusiastic use of exaggeration. Exaggeration is one of the 12 fundamental principles of animation. I'll get around to making a video dedicated to it someday, but to give the short version, exaggeration is about pushing the movement and posing in your animation beyond realism in order to maximize its clarity, personality, or visual appeal. It's a very important element in all animation, anime very much included. And given the game's comedic tone, it makes complete stylistic sense for Zenless Zone Zero to lean into using exaggeration more heavily. But as with all of the animation principles, execution matters, and frankly, there is a lot of exaggeration in these shots in places where it doesn't really belong. Exaggerating the movement in a high-energy action shot or a comedic double-take is one thing, but even casual conversation in these scenes is so often given these big exaggerated arcs, exaggerated anticipation, exaggerated overlap. These are important animation principles, yes, but it's important for the animator to also know where they aren't needed. Even when you are working within an exaggerated style, if you are hitting every single line at maximum energy and emotion, the resulting performance is going to feel less sincere, and also just be kind of exhausting to look at after a while.
Yet again, we're seeing overgeneralization and lack of specificity. He doesn't go through a single example with any detail to show or clarify the threshold between appropriate versus inappropriate exaggeration, so it's left ambiguous. People can be energetic even in casual conversations, so that point is wrong on its face. Casual doesn't mean low energy. The same applies to the point made about sincerity.
Some of these shots almost look like those TikToks you see of people imitating the movement of animated characters.
Why are we talking about TikToks?
To be clear, I like these. What these creators are doing is really impressive. But if you're an animator, and this might sound counterintuitive, you generally don't want your animated acting to resemble this. Because the thing is, these performers are themselves already doing an exaggerated imitation. They are imitating recognizable cliches about the ways we've all seen animated characters act. So if the performances you're animating resemble an exaggerated imitation of a cliché, that's probably not a good sign.
What we have is a weak analogy that borders on circular reasoning because it's ignoring context. The reason that any given animated acting, not just Zenless, may resemble a TikTok is because that is the performance that they were trying to imitate in the first place. Sonic isn't a fake hedgehog because he looks like Shadow, who is a fake hedgehog. It makes as much sense as saying this about Hotel Transylvania. It's calling the original a fake because the fake looks like the original. Just because two things may resemble each other, that doesn't mean they necessarily share the same characteristics. All in all, this is a very roundabout and indirect way of talking about acting cliches again, which we already went over. It's being used as an intellectual shortcut rather than analyze any animation in the game independently.
And these over-animation issues are not helped by the faces in these cinematics. For some reason, there is a noticeable mismatch in the level of exaggeration being applied to the body compared to the facial expressions. Anime faces have incredible capacity for emotional expression, from the extreme to the subtle. And these expressions just aren't fully delivering at either end of that spectrum.
The argument of there being a mismatch between the body and faces is underdeveloped. What constitutes a mismatch? What should the faces be expressing compared to the current execution? What standard is it being measured against? Without clarification, this criticism comes off as nebulous and if anything is more indicative of his own personal preferences, biases, and expectations than any actual problem with the animation. Besides that is the usual issues of a lack of concrete examples and making blanket statements instead of well-reasoned critique. Why aren't the expressions delivering? They just aren't. Because he said so.
And then there's the issue of clarity. In their attempt to infuse these scenes with more rapid, over-the-top energy, which is then further amplified by the real-time physics causing every movement to cascade down every loose or bouncy extremity these characters have, the animators have filled a lot of these shots with unnecessarily distracting motion, a near constant barrage of visual noise. Good animation, like good cinematography, directs your eye. It uses motion to draw your focus to specific places in the frame, uses stillness where necessary to avoid distracting that focus, or sometimes to give your eyes a chance to absorb a visual before it changes. And these cinematics, in their eagerness to pack in stylish motion, are frequently sabotaging their own ability to do that.
At this point, I'm going to start to sound repetitive, but no specific examples are used. And this is largely a retread of what I already covered in the section about physics and overlap. But what's even worse is that since we're talking about clarity, this section of the video in particular, there is a noticeable mismatch in what's being said versus what's shown. When he makes the sweeping generalization of a near constant barrage of visual noise, the footage shown is literally just an over-shoulder shot of a dude looking at a computer screen. Wow, so much visual noise. A constant barrage. I can't tell what's going on. And right after, he's talking about using stillness to give your eyes a chance to absorb a visual before it changes. The next clip from Zenless does exactly that. Look, notice how when the guy leans forward, he's holding this pose for multiple frames. This is why you should actually go through examples instead of playing them in the background as a sort of visual filler. Because when it overtly misaligns with what you're saying, it comes off as a result of motivated reasoning. It's forcing a claim whether it makes sense or not. It makes you less credible and less reliable.
I saw another animator describe all of this over-animation as the equivalent of jangling keys at a baby, which is a little harsher than I'd have put it, but I mean, yeah, a little bit. Even within a heavily exaggerated and stylized aesthetic, this is over-animation. This is a lot of movement without purpose, style over substance. There is a difference between exaggerated acting that conveys genuine emotion and emotional pantomime that merely hits a lot of cute poses along the way. More movement does not always mean better animation.
Well, that explains the earlier section and why there was that confusing mention of style over substance, even though it makes no sense in this context. I'd be remiss to not mention that something very evasive occurred here. It's that tactic of using someone else's harsher opinion while being able to distance yourself from the full weight of it. There's no reason to bring someone else's opinion into the critique like this other than to bring in negative commentary without directly owning it. It's cowardly and disingenuous. And that's it. That's the entire critique. From here on, the video changes topic to why we should care about over-animation. As a reminder, the point isn't that Zenless doesn't have over-animation, but that New Frame Plus does a poor job of making that critique. One of the biggest problems the video has, and it's a problem that many game critics or critics in general have, is that it is overscoped. Rather than being more focused and zoomed in on a specific example or set of examples, it tries to extend the critique to cover every animation and every cinematic in the entire game. You could only argue what you can support, and that depends on how much time you're willing to give, so that's not something that you can meaningfully cover in only 5 or 6 minutes. And in that very small amount of time, you have to pick your examples wisely, which New Frame Plus fails to pick hardly any at all. Moreover, there are numerous instances of overgeneralization, where broad, general claims are made without sufficient evidence to support them. It's biting off more than you can chew, a typical result from overscoping. For example, the criticism of visual noise fails to account for the varied ways in which different characters and animations employ overlap and follow-through. And as we saw in the last section about clarity, by not examining specific examples, the critique becomes less grounded in the actual details of the game and more reliant on sweeping judgments. It's ultimately saying very little. It doesn't allow the analysis to inform the conclusion. I was initially going to do an animation analysis of my own so that I could provide a contrasting example, but as I was looking for the game cinematics to download, I came across Dylan, who just so happens to have videos that cover the game's animations. Let's look at some samples. Here's how Dylan covers a cinematic.
And then she lands in such a great pose. I mean, look at the low focal length of this pose, right? Her foot is really big, it's really dynamic, it's just beautiful. Right into this anticipation, you'll notice that there's actually a bit of drag here. She doesn't immediately come up. They wait a little bit right here just to bring that anticipation up, just enough time to bring this slash to a huge payoff. And boy, does it do that. Now this part, this is actually a technique similar to what we've done before, what I like to call a treadmill shot. This treadmill shot is basically when the background moves, but the character doesn't move in camera space. Notice how still she is. They really just decided to accentuate this pose like crazy, right? So what this does specifically, these kicks, is that it holds the pose similar to how you would see it in 2D, which makes it feel really, really snappy and really dynamic. So notice how it just holds the pose for a few frames. In 3D, you would not have that, but in 2D, you would definitely have those poses held for extra impact. And they're mimicking that here really, really well. The camera's rotating, but she's not. And the reason is because she's parented to camera. So this is a very common technique with 3D trying to mimic 2D, especially with super fast moving backgrounds. You parent the characters to the camera so that it acts more like a 2D cell. Because when people draw 2D characters, it just stays in camera space and the background will move behind them. And that's mimicking that exact feeling.
And here's New Frame Plus.
Good animation, like good cinematography, directs your eye. It uses motion to draw your focus to specific places in the frame, uses stillness where necessary to avoid distracting that focus, or sometimes to give your eyes a chance to absorb a visual before it changes. And these cinematics, in their eagerness to pack in stylish motion, are frequently sabotaging their own ability to do that.
The squash and stretch here is huge. Look at her torso. That's not how long her torso is supposed to be. And then very, very squashed here. And then everyone else does the same thing. Look at this. Boingo, boingo, just straight up. And Ambi does it as well, but in a more subtle way. That's what's so great about this concept. Squash and stretch is actually not always stretching beyond normal limits. It's also just, hey, I'm elongated here and now I'm squashed here. And so that bounce right there is so well done and so well transitioned with that rotation. And it continues to bounce a little bit more. Boom, boom, 2 more times that whole time. And even Billy is bouncy. I mean, it's just incredible. This is a small thing, but look at the attention to detail here. His eyeballs shake inside of his head. You see that? So his eyes come up and then they shake inside of his head. They're not stationary. That's so jello-y, dude. Look how far Billy is. It's so funny.
Anime faces have incredible capacity for emotional expression, from the extreme to the subtle. And these expressions just aren't fully delivering at either end of that spectrum.
One last example with Dylan Gu.
Nakomara! That's cute. That's cute. There's something that could be better for this. Her facial animation is the focus of this, and I love her animation in general, but I will note that this transition is a little bit sudden. Usually when people change expression drastically, it's accompanied with a blink to transition between the two. You'll notice that it kind of feels like there should be a blink or that there was a blink and you might have missed it. That's kind of what it feels like because the eye shape changes so much. So if you had a blink here instead, it would allow the transition to be really, really smooth. You would have the eye basically close from this shape into a flat shape, and then come out of the flat shape into the angry shape. It'd be really, really smooth. It'd be a lot better. It'd be a lot more natural, and you'd be able to get exactly the poses that you want. I would also recommend just like bringing her eyebrows down a little bit more. If the eyebrows are down a little bit more, you'll be able to emphasize the anger pose, which will make the eyes and stuff read a lot better.
Meanwhile,
and some of these shots are like watching an acting cliche speed run. Like, how many moe poses can you squeeze into 5 seconds?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
so you can see how the difference between the two are night and day, and how they function as critique. And in Dylan Gu's case, it wasn't necessarily the explicit purpose of his video. Unlike New Frame Plus, Dylan Gu is going through specific cinematics and engaging with their details. He's bringing in his own knowledge and experience as a professional animator to highlight their strengths and weakness, and even providing actionable insights, a sign of a critique that is more constructive. He's using the video as an analytical tool rather than visual filler by the fact that he's pausing, replaying, rewinding, and drawing over them and going frame by frame to showcase certain observations versus just telling you. He doesn't make vague statements or broad unsupported claims and sticks to analyzing how specific elements of the animation are executed. That is more along the lines of how you properly do critique.